Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. Today we're going to take a look at a Monoprice Stage Right 15 watt tube amp. I'm actually going to do a tear down and inspection, give kind of some review on how this amp is made. Somebody that has tinkered with building their own tube amps from scratch by hand. It's kind of a fascinating contrast, kind of a product of modern global economics and how cost of labor and all those things, cost of products is just how, what is the most minimum amount of cost that you can do to build a functioning guitar tube amplifier. This thing, I paid $140 for it. I think brand new they were like maybe $200 or less. And so this, is a modern marvel of economics. You can buy a functioning guitar tube amplifier for that cheap. So I want to tear it down. I want to see how it's made and kind of give you some thoughts from somebody that's built their own tube amps. So if you're curious in that, let's go ahead and dive in. Alright, you can see the inside of the cabinet here. Now this cabinet overall is not the largest cabinet in the world. I'd say it's a relatively undersized 1x12 cab. To me, this seems to be a 1/2 inch material. Looking here at some of these screw holes, it looks to me like it's probably made out of some kind of particle board. The materials used here are definitely these little cleats here are plywood of some kind. So the construction materials used on the building of this cabinet is definitely low, but also I don't notice anything extremely horrible. It's fine. You've got the Celestion 7080 speaker. One thing to note about how the cabinet is joined, it's just butt joints, and then they do have these silver corner protectors that also seem to be providing some structural support and integrity. They've got them on every side, and I think that's what's, because there's nothing inside here to kind of improve these joints. And yeah, I don't see anything to indicate that they're like finger jointed or anything like that. I'd be very surprised. So not to be surprised, but worth noting that this amp definitely has some more inexpensive construction methods being used. Here's the reverb tank. It is probably the cheapest, smallest, dinkiest looking little reverb tank that I have ever seen. For comparison, this is like one that I'd put in my Super Reverb. This is a nice big long 3-spring, this is a 2-spring tank. I don't know how many springs are in there, but I think swapping out the reverb tank, I might actually want to do that. But there's a look inside the cabinet. Okay, we got the chassis out here. You can see they basically just took some metal and kind of folded it into a kind of like a horseshoe type shape. A lot of PCB boards. Let's look here on the bottom. This is the power transformer. It's a Ventec 6094A, and the output transformer is a Ventec 6093. My initial subjective thoughts is that these are the puniest, dinkiest little transformers I have ever seen. I'm actually kind of amazed that they are able to function with an amp like this one. Being a push-pull 15-watt amp, this little output transformer is teeny tiny, eeny weeny. Smaller than a 5E3 transformer that I've seen. I mean, this is, yeah, and this power transformer as well. These are small little transformers, but it is kind of to be expected. Looking here, I've got, now this amp I bought used. There are 2 JJ power tubes and then preamp tubes. This is a Ruby. This one just says China EL84. And really nothing to see on this side. So somebody upgraded the tubes, at least these 2 preamp tubes, to JJs. I would not be surprised if these were original to the amp. Okay, you can see the power cord comes in right here. We've got a green wire that goes right here that's bolted to the chassis. That's good grounding practice. And then looks like we've got a white wire and a black wire. Appears to me that the black wire runs into this fuse, which goes into the gray wire, into this switch. white wire goes into the switch. The switch is a double pole, double throw on-off switch. And then that goes directly into the leads of this power transformer right here. The primary side of the power transformer is on this side, and then the secondary is on this side. Now, this is the top side. This is where the pots are all mounted. You can see they look like these got these little tiny Chinese mini-sized potentiometers, and each of them are plugged into this green PCB here. And then you've got, out of the PCB, we've got, for example, this white wire, this black wire that run signal down here to this board here. So looking at the schematic, it talked about like what I thought maybe were relays, but there clearly are these interconnects. Now this is the main circuit board. These three are actually the filter caps. They say 450 volt, 22 microfarads. They are tiny. They are labeled with Chang, C-H-A-N-G on the side. And these got to be the smallest little filter caps I have ever seen. We do look like we have some like through-hole type capacitors and resistors. So actually that's kind of nice. Although, just kidding. Way back in here, I think I can see some surface mount components. I do not really care for surface mount components personally. I've never really gotten into micro soldering, so if I have to do any micro soldering, I might just quit. But we'll see. I don't know. It looks like a pretty typical. Right here it says 2016 or 15T 2016-1811. Got another marking down here. It dates this thing back to 3/25 of 2017. There is a adjustment pot right there. It's labeled TR2. And another one over here that's labeled bias adjustment. So I do recall seeing two of those on the schematic, so that's kind of interesting. Looking over here, this is the speaker output leads and the speaker output jack. Big old resistor on there. I don't love these clip-on connectors personally, but I guess they are what they are. You can see our output transformer right here. I would guess this would be the primary side and this would be the secondary side. Our input jacks right up here. I had a question about, so the 1 watt jack is the close one. So this one here is the 1 watt, the one underneath it is the 15 watt. This board runs into this right here. Overall, my initial reaction is it looks like a pretty typical, low-cost, made in China type circuit, PCB circuit board. I don't see anything really problematical with it. I think it should work fine. But it'll be a little bit challenging to work on, especially the surface mount stuff. Another thing to note, you can see in here that the tube sockets do appear to be mounted directly to the PCB, which is pretty annoying, but there's a lot of like glue and silicone and stuff holding everything down. So overall, it's a pretty much on par with what I had expected. Everything that you're seeing in here, every single one of these components are probably the cheapest possible thing that you could get. Just, you know, for example, these filter caps. I bet these are the cheapest possible filter caps available in the world today. So I'm sure that's true for the resistors, the caps. You know, everything is just has got to be very, very budget-minded with all the individual component selections. One other note I want to make here, this is the gain control, and it is a dual gang pot. You can see there's two layers there that are connected down into that board. So it is a dual layer potentiometer. So as when we're looking at the schematic, there was some interesting discussion in the comment section about that. And yeah, now we know I believe it's not only changing the voltage divider between the first two stages, but it's also changing the cathode of that second gain stage as well, which is very interesting. So, okay, so I've been tinkering around with this. This is the main component board. I'd like to get it out. So you've got these standoffs right here. There's 4 of them, which need screws. But then on the bottom side, the tubes have these like shields that were glued and screwed on. And so once those have been removed, I believe this whole thing, it will be able to come out. Gotta unplug some of these clips. But yeah, that will get the component board out. It looks like, I'm guessing a lot of the components, there's the relay. Hello, buddy. I'm guessing a lot of these components in here, surface mount, are probably going to be the ones I'm going to be looking at. And to be honest, I've never worked with surface mount components before. They're pretty tiny. I'm not super interested in that, but because we've got the access to the tube sockets, I might be able to get around that by just removing those micro components and using the tube sockets directly, but it might be a little bit weird. So I'm going to need to look at this and think about it. Okay, so let's kind of summarize what do we see. Well, overall, there was not a lot of stuff that really surprised me, but it was very interesting to look at the guts of this amp. For starters, the overall build of the exterior, kind of using a particle board with, this kind of Tolex, and you got those metal clamps on the corners. That is about as simple and inexpensively that you can build a box as possible. The size of the combo cabinet is small and undersized and not going to be as conducive to tone, but you could use alternate materials. You could use hardwoods, you could use plywoods. I don't know, the fact that you use this particle board, it may impart some bit on something onto the tone, but really overall, I don't actually think that the construction of the cabinet itself is going to cause a lot of problems. I think the cabinet's going to be sturdy and rigid enough to withstand being kind of battered around, and I wouldn't have thoughts that the cabinet is going to be your point of failure on this amp. So then next, looking at the rest of it, the chassis, it was kind of this shallow U channel. Was disappointed with the chassis. The metal that they used was very inexpensive, very thin gauge metal, so it certainly, if it gets kind of bumped or bruised too much, it could even start to bend or flex a little bit if it took a hard blow. It was just a strange, it was just odd how thin it is. Also, the construction being with that kind of U shape also makes it hard to get into it and to access it and to mess around with things. So if you do need to service the amp or change components, it is difficult to do that just given to the construction of the chassis. Also, the speaker, it is a Celestion speaker, and I appreciate that they use a Celestion speaker, but the 7080 is one of the more inexpensive speakers on the market and is not one that really impresses me too terribly. It's not super efficient. I don't think it has good bass response, and the treble I don't think is super pleasing. And so I elected to change out the speaker in mine, and I have been really happy that I've done that. So even though it is a Celestion speaker, they're using that Celestion brand name, I don't actually think that highly of the speaker that they chose. Other hardware components, like for example the transformers, these new tech, that's not a name brand that I have a lot of familiarity with, and the size of them, they were very small transformers, so you're not getting big iron. If you look at some of the old black panel or silver panel Fenders that became so timeless, the Marshalls, you look at more modern designs like some of the Dumble amps, they are known for having big, robust transformers, right? So think about like an old silver face Fender Twin, right? The transformers on the thing are going to survive a nuclear war. So, even if you mismatch the speakers for a little bit, they're not going to blow up because they're so robust. Or, even just the current capacity that those power supplies, those power transformers are supplying is high. It's over spec. Whereas I bet that these transformers are just barely scratching the minimum specification when it comes to providing the amount of current that's required or their ability to handle the voltages that's being put through them. And, Also I imagine that the output transformer might contribute a little bit if you really push it to adding a little bit of distortion that may not be in a pleasing way all the time. So, I do think the transformers are pretty small. I was a little disappointed with them. The reverb tank also was kind of like very, very inexpensive, small, and the reverb circuit as a whole is just very underwhelming, I think in part because of the reverb tank. And I may experiment with swapping it out, or I've even kind of wondered about trying to bridge the input-output of the reverb and using it more as a boost circuit rather than for the reverb itself, just because it was so underwhelming. Next, the overall construction of the amp, it was what I expected. It had a printed circuit board design. The PCB was fine. It was not the most robust PCB I've ever seen, but I didn't have any problems with it. I didn't have a lot of difficulty working on it. Sometimes the solder that they used, if they do like kind of this wave soldering, sometimes it's just kind of weird and it doesn't detach well if you try to use a wick or a solder sucker. But I had no problems with this. I did feel like working on it, I was taking a big risk. That it felt very possible that you could damage a trace, or if you overheated something, it could lift. There was just a lot of potential for problems. So I didn't have a lot of confidence in the PCB to hold up with a lot of exposure to a soldering iron and doing some modding. Also, just the way that even for example, the filter caps that they used were tiny little Chinese filter caps and not going to inspire a lot of confidence. You think about old Fenders, again, they're notorious for, those filter caps might last you 40 years. I would be quite surprised if these filter caps lasted you even 20 years with consistent use. I don't have any personal experience about that, but that's just what I would anticipate, given how small they are. They're going to be more prone to failure at random times, and just a little more problematic in general compared to a higher quality, more robust filter cap. Even the manner in which they did the construction, right, it was a mix of through-hole components, which is what I'm more used to, and surface mount components. And I don't really care for dealing with surface mount components. I think micro soldering is difficult to do. So, even if you have an amp tech that can service an amp, to find somebody that also can do surface mount, that's an even smaller subject. And so, just making the amp as a whole really was not designed to be repaired or serviced. This is probably an amp that was designed that you would buy it, use it for the duration of its life, and then once the parts start to wear out, it doesn't make sense to spend $100 to service a $140 amp. And so you just throw it away. And that's clear with the design of all the parts that they use, right? The parts are not high quality. You don't recognize any caps or resistors, right? They're just using probably the most inexpensive caps and resistors and caps that they can find in their factory. And again, that mix of surface mount with through hole and then kind of the clips, it's got 3 different PCBs, which I always dislike. So you really kind of have to take the whole thing apart in a needless way just to access it. Whereas I think a really nice hand-built amp, you take the chassis out and it's all laid out in front of you, easily accessible. And so the overall construction was not surprising to see that, but disappointing nonetheless. Not an easy amp to work on. Now, to kind of summarize all these things though, none of this was surprising to me, and I also would say none of it really presented such a tremendous problem or error that, it's like, oh, I can't believe that they did that. I mean, the build techniques used in this amp really aren't that different than what I've seen with like a lot of made in Mexico Fender amps. If you look at like a Blues Junior or like other budget, like a PV or something. Even honestly, I think I've seen some gut shots of like some Mesa Boogies that kind of use similar construction methods, like with their PCB and using the multiple layers and connecting things. Even saw more recently a new Gibson amp that got reissued that seemed to be using similar construction techniques. So this is kind of the new wave of how they do things in these factories. So I wasn't surprised by any of that. And ultimately, while I do feel like the reliability of this amp maybe isn't going to be super rock solid, I also don't think I have any glaring or major problems. It's just that, if some of these cheaper components fail, it's going to be hard to work on. That's just the nature of the beast. So in the end, wasn't really surprised by what I found. I wasn't thrilled about it, but also I wouldn't say I'm walking away feeling like, oh, this thing's horrible. I regret purchasing it. I think it was in line with my expectations, and for $140, I'm still pretty pumped that this is a really cool little amp to play. So take those thoughts for what you will. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. I still think it's kind of a modern marvel of economics that we're able to purchase a functioning tube-driven guitar amplifier that's actually can sound pretty good and be pretty functional for such little money. Let me know your thoughts down below. See you again soon. Thanks. Bye.